The void beyond Jupiter burned with the arrival of an armada. Pale blue plasma flared along the curved hulls of warships, their engines pulsing like arteries feeding a beast too large to comprehend. Commander Vecren stood on the bridge of his command vessel, his elongated pupils narrowing as he watched the massive world ahead. Earth, a planet that defied every expectation. His orders were simple: subdue, pacify, dominate. Yet for the first time in his career he hesitated. It wasn't the planet itself that unsettled him. It was the reports. Vecren shifted his gaze to the data streams running along the control interfaces. He read the figures once more, expecting them to change. They didn't. Gravity, crushing. Atmosphere, denser than expected. Storm patterns, erratic, aggressive. His clawed fingers tapped the edge of the console as his second-in-command, Officer Harvuk, approached. "Readings are confirmed, Commander," Harvuk said, his tone measured, but uneasy. "This world should be uninhabitable. And yet they thrive." Vecren didn't need to look at him to know what expression he wore. Doubt. The kind that had ended campaigns before they even began. The viewport dimmed as their fleet entered high orbit. Below, the blue and green expanse of Earth spun lazily, clouds stretching in fierce, chaotic patterns over vast continents. A perfect illusion. No world with such violent systems should sustain life, let alone civilization. Vecren exhaled sharply. "Deploy the first wave. Small units, no heavy artillery. Let's see how fragile they really are." Harvuk hesitated. "Sir, standard protocol dictates—" "I am not interested in protocol." Vecren's voice sliced through the stale air. "I am interested in results." The order was sent. From the belly of the lead warship, dropships disengaged. Slipping through the planet's upper atmosphere, the hulls glowed against the friction, burning streaks across the sky like falling blades. Their destination, a seemingly isolated research station, positioned deep within an arid region of the planet. No visible military presence, no orbital defenses in range. An easy first strike. Vecren leaned forward, talons flexing against the metal frame of his seat. The Dominion had conquered over 70 systems. This would be no different. But as the drop pods broke through the cloud cover, the first anomalies appeared. Winds surged in unnatural patterns, currents shifting mid-air, knocking smaller crafts off trajectory. Atmospheric sensors flickered, struggling to interpret the abrupt shifts in air density. Then something worse. The transmissions cut off. One by one, the strike team's signals vanished. No warnings, no distress calls, just silence. Harvuk stiffened. "Commander, we've lost contact with the ground forces." Vecren's jaw tightened. That wasn't possible. Even in the worst engagements, there was always something. A broken transmission, an automated distress beacon. This question mark, this was absolute. A cold realization crept through him. Earth was not silent. It was waiting. The silence stretched too long, too complete. The Dominion's drop teams should have signaled confirmation by now. Position secured, resistance negligible, first stage complete. Instead, there was nothing. Vecren's talons drummed against his armrest, his patience thinning by the second. The bridge felt stifling, despite the carefully controlled atmosphere. Every officer present had stiffened, antennae twitching, tails curling in suppressed tension. They were waiting for the inevitable follow-up order. "Re-establish contact," he commanded. Harvuk moved swiftly, issuing override protocols to pierce whatever interference had severed their link. Static, then more silence. The Dominion's encrypted signals, the same systems that had pierced planetary defenses across 70 worlds, reached nothing but empty bandwidth. "Commander," one of the technicians spoke, voice strained. "Secondary scans show nothing. No wreckage, no distress beacons, no pulse readings, as if they never landed." That wasn't possible. Vecren's claws flexed. The planet's gravity could have made extraction difficult, but there should have been debris, scattered signals, some sign of a struggle. "Deploy reconnaissance drones. Full perimeter sweep," he ordered. The drones launched, streaking toward the last known coordinates of the strike force. Minutes crawled by. Then, contact. The display flickered as footage streamed in. The station's metal exterior gleamed under a harsh sun, untouched. No battle scars, no evidence of a skirmish. The landing zone was vacant. No bodies, no ships, no sign of the Dominion's elite soldiers. The wind stirred through dry, dust-laden air, carrying faint echoes, the snap of metal, the creak of structures settling, the rasp of sand grinding over rock. A perfect illusion of stillness. Vekran's eyes narrowed. "Switch to thermal." The drones adjusted, revealing a scattering of heat signatures, small, scattered, rapidly dispersing. Then, without warning, one of the drones spun violently, the feed shaking. Blinding static flooded the display. Seconds later, another went dark. Vekran rose from his seat. "Pull them back." Harvick's fingers worked the controls, but the command went unanswered. One by one, the remaining drones winked out of existence, as if something had reached up from the planet's surface and swallowed them whole. A technician's breath hitched. "Sir, one drone remains. It's sending back partial visuals before—" The screen flashed with its final transmission. A figure standing among the shadows of the station. Humanoid. Motionless. The outline barely distinguishable against the reflective metal. Then the feed severed. Vekran's stomach coiled. This was no interference. No mechanical failure. Harvick turned, tension sharpening his voice. "Orders, Commander?" The air felt heavier now, pressing against his shoulders. This mission had shifted. It was no longer about conquest. It was about understanding what they had walked into. "Prepare a second wave," Vekran said, jaw tightening. "Double the forces." No one spoke. No one needed to. Whatever had erased the first team had done so without leaving a trace. Now, the Dominion would force Earth to show its hand. The second wave descended, carving streaks of fire through the atmosphere. 50 dropships, 500 soldiers, more than enough to crush whatever force had erased the first team. Yet, as Vekran watched their descent, unease threaded through his thoughts. Strength alone wouldn't explain what had happened. Harvick stood beside him, hands tight behind his back. "Orders remain the same?" Vekran's gaze stayed fixed on the tactical display. "We changed the approach." He gestured at the live feed grid, highlighting the vast terrain surrounding the facility. The barren expanse should have offered no cover, yet something had hidden the enemy well enough to eliminate their troops without a sound. "Break them into staggered landing formations," he ordered. "Smaller teams. No direct approach. I want crossfire zones established the moment boots touch the ground." Harvick relayed the commands, and the fleet adjusted. This time they would not walk blind into a slaughter. The ships split apart mid-descent, altering angles, circling the drop zone instead of landing all at once. A dust storm rose in the wake of their thrusters, rippling out in waves. The metal-laced air scratched against exposed skin as troops deployed, their visors adjusting to the distorted light. Vekran watched through the drone feeds, searching for any sign of movement. The facility stood untouched. The landing zone remained pristine. And then, for the first time since they had arrived, a response. The first transmission came from a lieutenant. 3 words. Clipped. Uneven. "Something is wrong." Vekran's claws curled against the metal railing. "Clarify." Static swallowed the line for half a second before stabilizing. "We're—" The soldier's voice hitched unsteady. "We're walking on the footprints of the first team." A sharp weight settled in Vekran's chest. That was impossible. The first wave had landed hours ago. There should have been bodies, gear, impact craters from the dropships. Instead, they were stepping onto ground as untouched as the moment before they had arrived. "Confirm your location," Vekran ordered, keeping his voice even. The lieutenant's response came faster this time, but something in his tone grated against Vekran's instincts. Exactly where the first team should have been. No debris, no shattered weapons, no blood. Vekran turned to Harvick, whose eyes had narrowed, antennae shifting in quiet alarm. He had seen war. He had commanded entire planetary invasions, and never had he seen the aftermath of a battle vanish. A pulse flickered across the readings, something brief, something fast, something moving just beyond the facility's perimeter. Then another, and another. Vekran's grip on the railing tightened. "Lieutenant, you are not alone." The feed fractured. The sound that followed wasn't screaming. It wasn't gunfire. It was silence, collapsing inward. One by one, the signals vanished. Harvok's voice was low, careful. "Sir?" Vekran straightened, spine locking into steel. "Pull them back!" Because whatever had wiped out the first wave hadn't just hidden the bodies. It had hidden the war. The last signal cut out like a severed vein. Nothing remained. No voices, no echoes. Only an open channel screaming absence into the command deck. Vekran stood rigid, his eyes locked onto the blank display. 2 full strike forces, erased. The weight of it pressed against his ribs like a vice. Not slaughtered, not even defeated. Just gone. Harvok exhaled through clenched teeth. "Sir, we have no confirmation of hostiles. No weapons discharged, no bodies. There is no logic to this." Vekran turned, slow and deliberate. "You think this is without logic?" His voice held the steadiness of a drawn blade. "Then you have never faced something smarter than you." Harvok stiffened but said nothing. Across the command deck, technicians worked in near silence, fingers moving over control interfaces with nervous precision. Every Dominion officer in the room had tasted war, but never like this. Never an enemy that fought without revealing itself. The reconnaissance feeds flickered. A single image broke through before the drone vanished, a shadow stretching across steel. Not a body, not a soldier, a shape where no shape should be. Then, static. Vekran's jaw set. He had given Earth its chance. Now they would stop waiting for answers. They would take them. He moved to the center console, claws tapping out rapid commands. "Deploy the orbital division. I want full atmospheric scans. Infrared, electromagnetic, sub-frequency sweeps. If something breathes down there, I want it identified." Harvok hesitated. "And the ground teams?" Vekran didn't look up. "The next wave lands in full armor. Heavy assault mechs. Firestorm-class drones. They burn anything that moves." The order spread through the fleet like a shockwave. Battleships shifted into formation, their cannon arrays rotating toward the planet below. In the lower decks, mechanized infantry readied for descent, their suits adjusting to planetary gravity. The Dominion had been patient. Now it would remind this world why patience was wasted on the strong. The first bombardment began, and the atmosphere trembled. Not an indiscriminate strike, a precision test. Each blast detonated at calculated intervals, churning up dust, collapsing weak structures, forcing movement, forcing the enemy to reveal itself. Vekran watched the readouts. No life forms detected, no sudden thermal shifts, nothing but wind scraping against ruins. Then the first detonation didn't stop. Not an explosion, but a reaction. The scanners howled as the ground ruptured, not from impact, but from something beneath it. A shape stirred in the dust. Large, uncoiling. Vekran's breath slowed. They hadn't been fighting an enemy hiding in the terrain. The terrain was the enemy. The final transmission from the front line broke through the static. A single voice, sharp with realization before it was cut short. "They built the battlefield under our feet." The ground didn't just shift, it recoiled. Steel plates, once thought to be remnants of a research facility, peeled back like the cracked shell of a dying beast. Beneath it, something ancient stirred. Not a bunker, not a base. A construct buried so deep it had been mistaken for bedrock. The Dominion's firestorm drones scattered, repositioning to scan the anomaly. Readings came back in flickers, material density off the charts, no biological markers, no power sources. Yet it moved. Vekran's claws tightened against the console. This wasn't a defensive position. It was a trap they had already stepped into. Harvok's voice cut through the tension, low and urgent. "Orders, Commander." Vekran didn't respond immediately. His gaze flicked between the live feeds, noting the slight tremor in the atmospheric pressure readings, the way dust particles hovered too long before settling. Something beneath the surface was generating force, subtle but vast. like an ocean holding its breath before the wave. The construct below twisted again, edges folding in impossible patterns. One of the Dominion's mechanized assault teams edged forward, their scanners sweeping for anything resembling an entry point. Then the first one fell. No explosion. No visible impact. Just movement. One moment there, the next gone. The remaining soldiers pivoted, weapons raised. Nothing to shoot, nothing to track. Only an absence where their comrade had stood. Harvick's throat bobbed. "They're being taken." Vekrin barely glanced at him. "I can see that." Another flash, this time caught by the drones. A shape flickered between the torn steel and shifting dust. Not humanoid, not mechanical. Something adjusting its form as it moved, adapting to the angles of the environment like liquid thought. A pulse rippled through the wreckage. Not energy, not a weapon. Something more visceral. The remaining soldiers staggered, hands clamping against the sides of their helmets. Their comm channels screeched, a burst of sound too raw to be distortion. One of them gasped, a word torn from his throat like an instinct, not speech. "It's in our heads." Then the feed severed. Harvick took a half-step forward. "Commander, we need to—" Vekrin lifted a hand, silencing him. His officers waited for an order. He waited for certainty. Neither came. The final drone, the last mechanical eye still transmitting, caught something before the screen darkened. A final image seared into the tactical display, a structure beneath the surface. Not a ruin, a machine built into the planet itself. Its framework pulsed with something old, something designed to activate under specific conditions. Conditions like an invasion. Harvick's voice was barely above a whisper. They didn't build a defense system. His eyes met Vekrin's. They built a warning. Vekrin exhaled, slow and steady, and we ignored it. The silence stretched. Then at last, he spoke. "Pull back the fleet." But deep down, he knew it was already too late. Vekrin's command should have been absolute. Pull back, regroup, recalculate. Yet the order hung in the air, ignored by the chaos unfolding below. The ground war had already begun, except the enemy refused to be seen. Tactical feeds flickered with half-formed images, blurred and distorted. Figures shifted between frames, slipping between metal husks and fractured terrain like ghosts. The Dominion soldiers fired blind, their targeting system scrambling to lock on to anything solid. Nothing stuck. Harvick's voice sharpened. "Our forces are still engaging. We need to extract them before—" A new reading flared across the consoles. A ripple in the electromagnetic field, too precise to be natural. Vekrin's breath slowed. A signal. Buried beneath the surface, layered under false interference. It had been there from the beginning. They hadn't noticed because it hadn't wanted to be noticed. Until now. A sharp crack ruptured the air. Not a detonation. A shift in weight. A controlled collapse. Below, the landscape shuddered. Steel foundations buckling under something unseen. One of the officers flinched. "Commander, seismic readings just spiked." The facility wasn't collapsing. It was opening. Metal groaned, twisting as vast sections of the ground pulled apart. What should have been a subterranean bunker unfurled, revealing structures too large, too symmetrical, too deliberate to be ruins. Harvick muttered, "This isn't a battlefield." Vekrin barely moved. "Number, it's a vault. A containment field, not to keep enemies out, but to keep something in." The realization came too late. The Dominion's ground forces were still firing into the storm of shifting terrain, trying to kill what they didn't understand. A mistake. A fundamental miscalculation. The first casualty reports confirmed it. Not gunfire, not explosives. The soldiers weren't being overpowered. They were being stripped away. One by one, their readings failed. No traces left behind. No signals, only a hollow space where life had been. Harvick clenched his jaw. "We need to get them out of there." Vekrin didn't answer. His eyes were locked onto the vault's structure, the dark corridors spiraling inward, disappearing into a space that refused to reflect light properly. The humans had built this place, but not for themselves. The tactical grid flared again. The interference lifted, just for a second. long enough for them to see. The missing soldiers, standing, motionless, still in full armor but changed, slight distortions in posture, in shape, as if something else wore them now. Vecren felt it then, a pressure curling at the base of his skull, something reaching, stretching toward his thoughts. The vault hadn't been locked to keep something from escaping. It had been locked to keep something from waking. And now it was awake. The soldiers stood too still. Their armor remained intact, weapons gripped in practiced formation, but something beneath the surface had shifted. They no longer belonged to the Dominion. Vecren didn't need biometric scans to confirm it. The way they moved, or didn't, was enough. The men he had sent into battle had been efficient, trained, predictable. What remained were empty vessels. Harvick's breathing turned shallow. "Orders, Commander?" Vecren kept his voice even. "Do not engage." Harvick hesitated, but the restraint in Vecren's tone held weight. They didn't know what they were dealing with. Not yet. Below, the standing figures twitched. A fraction of movement, like marionettes testing their strings. One of them tilted its head, as though listening. Then, in perfect unison, they turned. Not toward the Dominion forces still holding position. Not toward the vault behind them. They turned their heads skyward, toward the fleet. Vecren's pulse slowed. A sound, not quite a voice, bloomed in the open channels. A frequency too low, too stretched to be speech, but still carrying meaning. The illusion of words. "Observe." The soldiers moved. Not running, not charging. Closing the distance with the precision that defied physics. The Dominion forces barely had time to react before the first shots fired. Rounds connected. Armor shattered. Bodies fell. But they did not stay down. A fallen soldier's form convulsed, limbs locking in unnatural angles before stiffening into stillness. A beat passed. Then, impossibly, he stood again. Harvick's voice barely broke through the suffocating air. "That's not resuscitation." Vecren didn't reply. His mind was already racing ahead. The vault had been sealed for a reason. Its mechanisms weren't defensive, they were restraints. Something had been locked away inside, waiting for the right catalyst. And the Dominion had handed it everything it needed. The false soldiers kept advancing, their steps unhurried. They weren't fighting. They were acquiring. Another flicker of sound rippled through the open channels. "Observe!" Vecren forced his mind into clarity. There was no more time to study the unknown. They were already drowning in it. "Fleet-wide directive," he ordered, his voice razor-sharp. "Orbital fire on my mark. Full saturation." Harvick's head snapped toward him. "Sir, our men are still—" "They are gone," Vecren said flatly. "What's wearing them is not." Harvick swallowed hard, but he nodded. Above the battlefield, the Dominion warships realigned their weapons. Vecren lifted his hand. He would not let this spread beyond the surface. But before he could give the final command, the feed cut out. The ships, the targeting systems, the fleet itself, blacked out, and a voice, unmistakable now, whispered through the silence. "Now, you learn." Darkness swallowed the fleet. Vecren's display screens flickered, then died. Every tactical readout, every targeting system, every connection to the Dominion warships overhead. The command deck was silent, save for the unsteady breaths of his officers. The fleet was blind. Harvick stepped closer, his voice tight. "This isn't interference." Vecren didn't answer. He already knew. This wasn't some tactical jamming field. No electromagnetic distortion. This was control. A force had reached into their systems and severed their grip, not through brute force but with purpose. Below, the battlefield had shifted. The altered soldiers no longer advanced. They stood motionless, heads still tilted skyward, waiting. The vault behind them, now fully exposed, pulsed with something unseen, a force that didn't register on any Dominion scanners, yet pressed against the air like a shifting tide. Then the voice returned, clear now, directed. Lesson 1. The first explosion rocked the upper atmosphere, not from their ships, from Earth's surface. An eruption of controlled detonations burst along the planetary grid, each one placed with mathematical precision. Shockwaves rippled outward, igniting chain reactions along orbital paths. Unstable debris fields shifted, redirected, rearmed. Harvuk braced himself against the console. They're targeting our ships, not with conventional weapons, not with missiles or plasma cannons, with the remnants of every war fought before this one. Humanity had turned its own graveyards into weapons. A Dominion warship buckled as a fragment of a derelict satellite tore through its reinforced plating. Not debris, shrapnel designed to penetrate armor at hypersonic speeds. Vekran's pulse steadied. Tactical recalibration, defensive formations, redirect fire to surface launch points. No response. He exhaled, forcing control into his voice. All fleet channels confirm status. Silence, then laughter. Not the kind meant for amusement. Something colder, something from inside their own comm channels. The voice sharpened. Lesson 2. A second shift. The Dominion ships began to turn. Vekran's claws flexed. Who authorized a maneuver? No one had. They were moving on their own. Harvuk's fingers flew over the controls, but his expression paled. Sir, we're locked out. The fleet rotated, not toward a defensive escape route, not toward the battlefield, toward each other. Vekran's breath came slow. They weren't being destroyed. They were being repurposed. A vessel on the outer perimeter fired, not at the enemy, at another Dominion warship. The blast tore through its hull, sending ruptured metal and exposed wiring spinning into the void. Harvuk's voice dropped to a whisper. They're turning us into our own weapons. Vekran exhaled. They're teaching us how little we understand war. The Dominion fleet was not losing the battle, it was unraveling. Ships once synchronized in disciplined formations now moved like puppets with severed strings, turning against one another, shifting in ways that made no tactical sense. The firepower that had conquered 70 worlds was now tearing itself apart. Vekran watched in measured stillness, his mind racing past panic, past anger, straight into the cold clarity of survival. This was no ordinary engagement. It was a demonstration. Harvuk's voice wavered, though he tried to steady it. They're overriding our command systems, forcing collisions. Not forcing, Vekran corrected. They're guiding. Harvuk hesitated, then glanced back at the displays. The pattern became clear. Each impact was precise, each explosion not just a loss, but a calculated shift in positioning. They weren't being destroyed. They were being moved. Another warship jerked violently, thrusters misfiring, turning toward the planet at an angle that shouldn't have been possible. Vekran's stomach coiled. They're dragging us into orbit. The alarms flared. Ship by ship, the Dominion fleet was being pulled into a forced descent. A slow, deliberate fall, not a crash, but a reconfiguration. Earth wasn't breaking them. It was absorbing them. The voice returned, laced with something new. Less instruction, more amusement. Lesson 3. The darkness below shifted. Not a vault, not a trap, something else. Harvuk's hands tightened against the controls. What are we looking at? Vekran's jaw set. He wasn't sure yet, but the surface had changed. What should have been metallic ruins now stretched, shifting into unnatural symmetry, lines forming where there had been nothing, pathways constructing themselves from seemingly untouched land. A pattern, a structure. Harvuk exhaled, barely a whisper. This place is alive. Vekran ignored him. There had to be a way to counter this. The Dominion had faced planetary defenses before. AI-driven worlds, automaton armies. This was different. This was adaptive warfare on a scale they had never encountered. A final flicker across the display. Something beneath the surface shifted. Not steel, not machinery, something deeper. Vekran straightened. His claws tapped against the control panel. Find us a way out of this. Harvuk didn't move. His eyes stayed on the screen. Sir, the ships that went down first. Their signatures are still active. Vekran turned sharply. Harvuk's hands trembled over the console. They're still transmitting. The realization settled in his bones like a slow poison. The ships hadn't crashed. They had landed. Not destroyed, not lost, repurposed. The transmission channel flared open. This time, the voice wasn't human, wasn't Dominion. It was something in between. Lesson 4. You don't win wars. You become them. Vecrin's throat tightened as the transmission ended. The voice that had spoken was wrong. Too layered, too precise, too familiar. Not an enemy commander, not even a machine. Something else had spoken through their own lost ships. Harvick's fingers stiffened against the control panel, his breath shallow. Commander, our warships are still intact. Not wreckage, not debris. The Dominion fleet should have been burning, crashing, erased. But the ships that had been dragged into the planet's grasp were still active. Their hull signatures had changed, yet their core structures remained untouched. Harvick adjusted the frequency bands, pulling a feed from one of the ships that had gone dark first. The display flickered. Then slowly, a bridge interior came into focus. Vecrin's claws flexed. The command deck was occupied. Officers sat at their stations, movements precise, calculated. The captain stood at the helm, back straight. Everything appeared normal, until the captain turned. Vecrin's breath slowed. The face was the same. The uniform, the posture, even the faint tilt of the head, a perfect replication. But the eyes were wrong. Not blank, not empty. Too aware, as if something else was looking through them. Harvick tensed. That's Captain Ral. His words caught in his throat. He's looking at us. The Dominion officer on screen lifted his chin. Then, in a voice that should have belonged to Ral but didn't, he spoke. You misunderstand the nature of your failure. The display fractured, not static, deliberate distortion, controlled, like someone was pulling the image apart and reconstructing it as they pleased. For a fraction of a second, the visual corrected. There was something behind the Dominion crew. Not an army, not a shadow. Something formless, stretching through the ship like liquid intelligence, wrapping itself into the very structure. Then, a pulse, not sound. A force pressing into their skulls, heavy as a tide before a storm. Harvick's hands shook at his sides. What have they done to them? Vecrin kept his focus sharp. They didn't take the crew. They took the ships first. Then they made the crew fit the design. A pause. Then the captain, or the thing wearing his voice, smiled. You thought you were invading. The ship's interior began shifting before their eyes. Metal folding, controls rearranging, everything adjusting into something that wasn't Dominion anymore. You were never the conquerors. You were the materials. The transmission cut. Vecrin inhaled slowly. He had fought enemies that sought power, control, territory. This was different. This wasn't a war. It was a conversion. Vecrin had seen massacres, planetary sieges, civilizations burned down to embers. He had witnessed surrender, defiance, and extinction. But never this. This was not war. This was unraveling. The hollowed fleet still moved, their formations unbroken, their weapons primed, but they no longer belonged to the Dominion. They belonged to something else now. Harvick's voice carried none of its usual steel. Orders, Commander? Vecrin's claws curled at his sides. The usual orders did not apply. A fleet that had once been their greatest weapon was now part of the enemy. The main display flickered, then snapped into focus. The captured warships were turning, not to regroup, not to attack, to align. Vecrin's pulse steadied. They're forming a blockade. Harvick's hands hovered over the controls. Against us? No, Vecrin murmured. Against anyone else. It hit him all at once. The depth of the trap. The Dominion fleet was powerful, but in the grand scale of the galaxy, they were only one piece of a larger empire. When they failed to report back, more ships would come. A second wave, a reinforcement fleet, and when they arrived, they would find a blockade, an unbroken formation of Dominion warships, seemingly operational, seemingly intact, and they would trust them. Harvick's jaw tightened. They don't need to expand. They just need to wait for more of us to arrive. Vecrin exhaled sharply. It was worse than that. This was not an extermination. The enemy had no need for destruction, no desire to leave ruins behind. They wanted pieces, living, moving, thinking pieces. A slow, controlled expansion, not an infection, a replacement. A new voice cut through the open channel. Not an order, not a demand, an invitation. Lesson 5. The Dominion ships. What had once been Dominion ships moved in unison, their weapons powered down, their transmissions opened wide, not encrypted, not guarded, broadcasting across every known frequency, an invitation to the entire Dominion Empire, a call home. Vecren's claws dug into the metal console. Shut it down. Harvok's fingers moved fast, but every countermeasure was overridden before it could take effect. The transmission spread through every fleet network, every long-range beacon. The Dominion wouldn't just come looking for them. They would come believing the fleet had won. Harvok's breathing turned sharp. They'll send everything. And when they did, when the next armada entered the system, they wouldn't see the trap. They would see familiar faces, recognizable ships. They would approach, receive orders, dock for resupply, and then they would become part of it. Vecren's throat tightened. This wasn't a war humanity had to win. They had already won. Now they just had to wait. Vecren could not allow this to spread. His fleet, what was left of it, needed to move now. The Dominion's next wave would arrive expecting a victory, not a massacre hidden beneath polished steel. There was only one way to sever the cycle before it began. Escape, and then destruction. Harvok straightened as Vecren's decision solidified. If we leave, they'll know we've seen through the deception. They already know. Vecren gestured to the shifting fleet ahead. They aren't stopping us. They're watching what we do next. Harvok's throat bobbed. Then what's the plan? Vecren stepped forward, mapping variables in real time. Direct engagement was impossible. The compromised warship still carried Dominion-level defenses, firepower capable of crushing any resistance before it could break orbit. They could not fight, but they could still mislead. They want us to run, Vecren said. They want us to tell the Dominion leadership that the battle is lost, that Earth has been pacified and absorbed. Harvok frowned. But it hasn't. Vecren's claws tapped against the metal rail. It will be, if they aren't stopped. A battle plan was useless here. This was beyond battle now. This required misdirection, sabotage, and precision timing. Patch me through to the remaining ships, Vecren ordered. We have one chance to get ahead of this. Harvok relayed the command, and within seconds, the fleet's remaining loyalists appeared on the fractured display. We are retreating, Vecren announced without preamble. The fleet is compromised. We will not regain control. One of the captains bristled. We can't just leave them. They are no longer ours, Vecren snapped. If you hesitate, you'll become part of them. Silence. The remaining officers waited. Vecren let the weight of his words settle before delivering the only strategy that mattered. We will feign submission. He spoke evenly, clearly. We will fall back, transmitting falsified reports of surrender. We will let the Dominion believe this world is already under their control. Harvok's eyes sharpened with understanding. A delayed invasion meant a delayed infection. The Dominion wouldn't rush reinforcements into a world they believed had already been conquered. It would buy them time, but not enough. Harvok leaned in. They'll still investigate. They'll still send ships. Vecren nodded, which meant one thing. When we retreat, he said, voice steady, we leave nothing behind. The meaning struck instantly. They had to erase everything, not just themselves, the entire field, the vault, every remaining piece of infrastructure that could be studied, copied, repurposed. We set detonation points before we break orbit, Vecren continued. Time to trigger only if their ships attempt to access what's left. A false surrender, a buried trap, a stalled invasion. It wasn't victory, but it was the only way to make humanity wait for prey that never arrived. Vecren's orders spread through the remaining fleet like a controlled burn. They would not win this battle, but they could decide how it ended. The retreat had to be flawless, deliberate, no panic, no deviation. Any sign of disarray would expose the deception. The Dominion Standard Protocol dictated a withdrawal under overwhelming odds, and that was exactly what they would replicate. They would play the part of an empire that had lost. Harvok moved swiftly, coordinating the falsified transmissions. "We're broadcasting surrender reports across Dominion space. No resistance. No survivors." Vecren nodded. It had to be convincing. Not just words, patterns, tone, structure. The Dominion had centuries of tactical intelligence. If they sensed even a fraction of falsehood, they would send reinforcements faster than they could prepare. The detonation sequence had to be equally precise. Explosions would be useless if triggered too soon. Instead, they set a failsafe, a coded detonation embedded within the planet's remaining infrastructure, designed to activate only when the enemy moved to claim the territory. Harvick tightened the sequence. "They'll assume the destruction is part of their own expansion cycle." Vecren's eyes remained on the display. The Dominion's lost ships hung in eerie silence, positioned in perfect formation, as if waiting. No counter-movements, no attempts to stop them. He understood why. They had already won this war. They didn't need to chase fleeing ships. They only needed to wait for more to come. The fleet disengaged, following preset withdrawal routes. Weapons cold, shields nominal, no sudden bursts of movement. They had to look like prey limping away, not a force with a plan. As they ascended, Vecren glanced at the world below. Earth did not react. It simply watched. Harvick's voice was steady. "They're letting us go." Vecren nodded once. "They have no reason to stop us." Harvick exhaled. "Because they think we're already dead." The final sequence locked in place. Timed detonation, silent, waiting. Not active now, but dormant, embedded into the fractured remains of their invasion. Vecren sat back. The moment the next wave of Dominion ships attempted to access the battlefield, the destruction would trigger. Not an explosion that could be linked to an attack, but a collapse. Self-destruction, as if the fleet had never truly held control. It would leave nothing for them to take. No remnants, no war trophies, no understanding. The remaining Dominion Empire would arrive expecting territory. They would find ruins. And they would hesitate. Vecren clasped his hands together, talons pressing against each other. That hesitation would be their only chance. Because now, the Dominion was fighting an enemy that had already rewritten the rules. And they would never know when the next lesson would begin. The fleet moved in silence, leaving behind a battlefield no one would ever claim. Vecren watched the world shrink beneath them. It did not burn. It did not chase. It only waited, a predator with infinite patience. Harvick exhaled. "They'll send more ships." Vecren's claws flexed against the metal rail. "Yes. They'll come expecting control. They won't find it." Harvick's voice dropped, a whisper of restrained disbelief. "How do you fight something that doesn't need to win?" Vecren's gaze stayed locked on the planet below. The Dominion had always conquered through force, through overwhelming power and brutal efficiency. But this wasn't a war of strength. It was something else entirely. "They never saw us as a threat," Vecren murmured. "They never even considered us an obstacle. We weren't enemies." His voice darkened. "We were a resource." Harvick swallowed. "Then why let us leave?" Vecren turned, his eyes sharp. "Because we already belong to them." Harvick stiffened, but he understood. They had escaped nothing. They had simply been allowed to walk away, because Earth knew that sooner or later the Dominion would come back. Not out of strategy, out of inevitability. The next wave of ships would not come armed with caution. They would come seeking reclamation, eager to understand, to dissect, to control. And that was the real trap, because the lesson had never been about survival. The voice returned, not through comms, not through any system that could be severed. It arrived as a whisper, threading through space itself. Lesson 6. The warships beneath them. The ones they had lost, the ones now claimed, shifted as one. The lights along their hulls flickered, rearranging in precise sequences. Harvick's breath hitched. "What are they doing?" Vecren already knew. The message wasn't for them. It was a beacon, not a distress call, not a warning, an invitation. They weren't simply waiting for the Dominion to return. They were calling them. Harvick's hands curled into fists. What do we tell command? Vecrin's voice was calm. Too calm. We don't. The Dominion wouldn't listen. They never had. They would see hesitation as weakness. They would come with weapons sharpened, with fleets ready, believing that force could unravel what had already taken root. And when they did, they would find themselves not in a battle, but in a lesson, one they would not survive. Vecrin closed his eyes. This was never about Earth. Harvok's voice was brittle. Then what was it? Vecrin opened his eyes. It was about what happens when you give a Deathworld time to prepare. The last remnants of the fleet vanished into the void, but Vecrin knew they hadn't truly escaped. No one ever escaped something like this. Harvok stood rigid beside him, his posture carved from tension. Every officer aboard knew the truth now, knew that what they had witnessed was not a battle, not a victory, not even a loss. It was a demonstration, a slow, deliberate revelation of something far worse than war. Vecrin's gaze stayed fixed on the distant glow of Earth, a planet that had never fought for dominance because it had never needed to. Do we warn them? Harvok's voice was flat. Tell the Dominion what we saw? Vecrin's answer came without hesitation. It wouldn't matter. Harvok exhaled, but it was not relief. Then what do we do? Vecrin turned from the viewport, his steps slow, measured. We tell them what they want to hear, that Earth has fallen, that humanity was absorbed, that the system is ready for reclamation. Harvok's head snapped toward him. You want them to go back? They were going to go back anyway. Vecrin's voice was low, heavy with the weight of certainty. Now, we control the terms. Harvok studied him, waiting for the conclusion that had already settled in Vecrin's mind. They won't send a fleet next time, Vecrin continued. They'll send everything. An armada, a planetary occupation force, commanders who will believe themselves strong enough, brilliant enough, to dismantle what we could not. Harvok swallowed, realization dawning. And that's exactly what humanity wants. Vecrin nodded once. Because Earth did not hunt. Earth lured. The Dominion's greatest strength had always been its arrogance, the belief that nothing existed beyond its grasp, that every species, every world, could be broken down, conquered, made into something useful. But this time the trap wasn't one world. It was all of them. This wasn't the beginning of a war. This was the moment the galaxy learned what it meant to face a death world. The whisper returned, threading through their systems, untraceable, undeniable. A final lesson. You have already lost. The transmission was not a warning. It was a truth. And Vecrin knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that when the Dominion returned, it would not conquer. It would not fight. It would be swallowed. They had always thought the galaxy belonged to them, but they had never encountered a world like Earth. Harvok stared at the darkened displays, voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? Vecrin's gaze flicked back to the planet, still waiting, still watching. He answered without looking away. Now, we wait for the day they learn.